Hello and welcome to the Growing Healthy Families podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Haggerty. On this show, I interview the world's top health experts so that you can know with certainty what it takes to give your family a life of epic health and wellness.
As parents, we don't want to see our kids struggle. I knew that he had the potential, and I knew that something needed to be done.
It was hard. We would get frustrated. We didn't know how to deal with it. I was more emotional about it.
Sure that, we're here. Amen to that, brother. Amen to that. Welcome to the Growing Healthy Families podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Haggerty, and I am super excited for you to be able to just really dig in and get some awesome content out of today's podcast. So moms and dads, the gentleman that you see here in the screen next to me, this is Dr. Robert Melillo. He is one of the world's foremost pioneers in brain research as it pertains to neurodevelopmental disorders in kids and adults. I am super excited because he has authored some of my favorite books, Disconnected Kids, Reconnected Kids, Autism, the Disconnected Kids Nutrition Plan. He is a pioneer in the field of neurodevelopmental disorders. His research has led to the development of literally revolutionary functional neurological rehabilitative protocols that have improved the lives of thousands of kids and adults. Dr. Melillo, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Oh, thank you, Scott. I really appreciate you having me on.
Oh, believe me, it's very much our pleasure. And more importantly, I'm really excited to help to introduce moms and dads who are not aware of the work that you've done to what you're doing and really the kind of things that you're able to go and change the quality of the lives for a lot of kids that are struggling with neurodevelopmental disorders.
Yeah.
So moms and dads, let me give you a quick overview, just a synopsis of some of the things that Dr. Melillo has achieved already in his career. Many of you have already heard of Brain Balance Achievement Centers, and he is the co-founder of Brain Balance Achievement Centers. He is Fox News' expert on neurodevelopmental disorders. He is the founder of the IAFNR, which is an organization that does research and teaches doctors how to work with kids with neurodevelopmental disorders. He is the Senior Research Fellow with the National Institute for Brain and Rehab Sciences, doing work with things like PANS and PANDAS. He has a private practice out of New York, as well as lots of work that he's doing in terms of doing online counseling and working with people all over the country and all over the world. He has a master's degree in clinical rehabilitation neuropsych. He has a doctor of chiropractic, so love to have you as a part of the profession, Doc. He has a diplomate in functional neurology. He is a fellow of the American College of Functional Neuro, as well as a fellow for the American Board of Childhood Neurodevelopmental Disorders. That's quite a laundry list, Dr. Melillo.
Yeah, well, I'm probably older than I look, I think. That's it.
Well, you look great. So Doc, let's dig right in. First and foremost, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you really started to dive into the world of neurodevelopmental disorders, because this is a really big animal.
Yeah, well, when I graduated from school, my focus was always, and my interest was always in neurology and rehabilitation and finding a way to combine those together. And so when I started my practice, early on, I not only, got my subspecialty in both rehabilitation and neurology, but then I started teaching it. I started then doing research. The 90s, when I was just developing a lot of, my practice, was an exciting time. It was called the Decade of the Brain, and all this new brain research came out, and really exciting new functional ways of actually measuring the brain and looking at the brain in real time, which had never really existed before. So the idea of functional neurology, looking at the brain and realizing that in most problems there wasn't any actual damage to the brain or injury, but it wasn't a chemical problem, but it was more related to functional connections between networks and synchronization and what was called functional connectivity. And that's really been the basis of research, especially in the behavioral and mental health world and neurological world, really for the past 20 years or so. With more tools becomes more complex. So that was an exciting area. And we started looking at the concept of how networks connect and how the two hemispheres connect and integrate. And then one day, 1995, I come home and a woman sitting in my kitchen with my wife, and she's crying. My wife tells me that this woman has a son with severe ADHD. She's started an organization. She's done everything she could in mainstream treatments. Nothing has worked. And she says, you know, I think you can help her. In my practice, I had many different specialists with me. I had MDs, I had psychologists, I had nutrition, Chinese medicine, massage. So she knew I knew a lot of different things. So this woman was looking for, you know, anything, any other approach that might work. So my wife, you know, said she thought it would be good for me to try to help her. I told her I didn't really know what ADHD was at the time. I had 3 small children. I was working a lot. I didn't know if I had time for it. But then we went to a parent-teacher meeting 2 days later. And the teacher, my son was in 1st grade, she said, I think your son has ADHD. So now that really impacted me. Now these 2 things come together. I look at it as not a coincidence. You know, I feel like every other parent. I feel like I'm a failure for my kid. But I have the tools to think, okay, I know the brain. I know, you know, and like typical, especially chiropractor, I'm like, let me just get my hands dirty. And so my first question is, what is it? And I go around to all my friends and colleagues and people like pediatric neurologists and pediatricians and neuropsychologists, and I ask them, what is it? And they all tell me the same thing. We don't know. We have no idea. I don't know if anybody knows. So for me, that didn't make any sense. We see this epidemic rise in kids, but yet no one knows what it is. That didn't make sense to me. So I started doing the research on my own because I could, and I already had done some. I started connecting with other researchers around the world that were doing really cutting edge things. And within a relatively short period of time, I came up with what I believe still is the best answer to what is actually happening with ADHD. But then it came to realize that it wasn't just ADHD. It was basically all neurodevelopmental disorders problem. And that is something known as a functional disconnection. It's a developmental imbalance that happens between networks in the brain where certain networks are underdeveloped, they're underregulated, and they're underintegrated with other networks, and especially between the 2 hemispheres of the brain. And so what we see, you know, when I first started looking at what ADHD was, I came across research that right away said, there's this unevenness of skills, meaning that they're actually really good or exceptional or even genius at certain skills and really very far behind in others. And, you know, I was, what is that? That doesn't make sense to me. And having a rehab background and chiropractic background, you know, we think in terms of balance, right? That's kind of how we're taught. And so right away, it seemed like an imbalance to me. And so I started looking and I found that everything that kids did great in ADHD were left brain skills, and everything they struggled in, everything were right brain skills. Even they're looking down to how the right and left brain controls the digestive system, you know, all of their cognitive behavioral sensory, it all fit. So I believe that, you know, I had found the answer that nobody else really understood at that point. And then I spent, you know, 15 years really coming up, how do we measure this and document it objectively? And then how do we come up with specific targeted combinations of approaches and treatments to really change this in a measurable way? And that is what, you know, I developed as the Brain Balance Program. And that's what I've written in the book. And because it's a combination of things that we do in the center and things that we do at home. And that's really where the journey has kind of led me to. And we have now over about 120 centers. We've worked with over 40,000 kids. My books have sold, you know, about 300,000 copies worldwide. I think they're translated into 10 or 11 languages right now. And so I hear from people all over the world that even just use the book, that they're getting, you know, incredible results. I mean, we have like a 95% success rate for completely eliminating things like ADHD and dyslexia, OCD, Tourette's, and even, you know, certain types of autism.
That's tremendous. That's tremendous. Now, you know, by the time that many people get into the point are getting to the point where they're getting diagnoses, they've gone down the traditional medical route, done the medical assessments. So for those who aren't familiar with the difference between medical neurology versus functional neurology, can you give some clarity as to what would be different in terms of the analytical approach and in terms of the way that a treatment would be applied with medical neurology versus functional?
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, traditional medicine, including traditional neurology, is really based on acute injuries and damage. That's really what the model was based on, 100 years ago, when people really came to doctors mainly because they had acute injuries or illnesses or infections. 100 years ago, people weren't dying from as we see now. So, their model is really looking at kind of overt pathology and genetic mutations or, injury. Or infectious disease or viruses. And the vast majority of people that struggle with illness in general now, but especially mental and educational, and it's not any sort of acute injury. It's not because of any pathology in the brain or in the body. It's not a metabolic problem, and it's not a genetic problem. So what is it? The problem is, again, so the analogy that may make sense is that medical neurologists look for more hardware type of problems, whereas in functional neurology, we look at software problems, right? We're looking at there's something the way that the brain is not connecting and communicating that isn't because of damage. And more often than not, it's, induced by environmental factors and what we call epigenetic factors, where we alter gene expression but not damage genes. And this alters the way the brain communicates and talks to itself. And this is usually because of a developmental imbalance where certain areas of the brain are growing at a different rate than others. And so it's kind of a maturity imbalance, what's called a developmental asynchrony. So, this imbalance, this growth imbalance, is really the problem. It prevents the two sides of the brain from syncing up with one another. And they usually have exceptional skills. So we get overactivity of one side and underdevelopment. So like even ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, what we're looking at is hyperactivity is caused by overactivity of the left brain, over motor activity. The left brain is more motor. Same thing with the left brain will cause overactivity to cause obsessive thoughts or behaviors or addictive behaviors or compulsive behaviors or hyperactive behaviors. They're all driven by a left brain that is too high. Attention, long-term sustained attention and focus is what the right brain does. So we see a deficit of attention and we see hyperactivity of networks in the left side of the brain. And together they make up this disorder that we call ADHD. And almost everything like OCD or Tourette's or tics or movement disorders or depression or anxiety, almost all of them fit into this realm where some of the symptoms are because of overactivity in certain networks on one side of the brain, and other symptoms are because of an underactivity in the other side of the brain, and they combine together to produce things that we label as autism or Tourette's or OCD, but really what we're looking at are different imbalances in the brain.
Dr. Melillo, one of the things I like that you talked about is it being really more of a software than a hardware problem. But one of the things I think that a lot of moms and dads don't realize is that there are pathways that you can track down in development that oftentimes will give carrots for people to look for when they know what they're looking for to understand what road a child's brain is going down.
Right.
Now, obviously, you and I both know that kids and adults will sometimes present differently with these expressions. If a mom and dad is thinking, is this something that is affecting my child? What are some things that a mom or a dad would want to look for, both developmentally, but also in current time as a child ages, that would give them some indications of some brain imbalances?
Yeah, that's a great question, because really there are some things early on. And I think that most of these issues, we get to them really way later than we should. It's never too late, but it's also never too early. The earlier you can identify different problems, if you have means of intervening, then you can really alter the trajectory of the development of the brain and get things back on track and really correct the problems. And the thing that's important is that, as you were talking about with kids and adults, is that, a child with ADHD almost all the time will grow up to be an adult with ADHD, and then they usually will have their own children with ADHD. So it perpetuates it. So if you can stop that at a certain age and literally fix the problem at its core, you end all of that. You don't have the adult problem, and most of the psychological issues that we look at now, even in adults, really we know start in childhood. And even schizophrenia, which doesn't show up until the 20s, we know that it probably starts in the womb, but that you can even identify it in the first year. So most of the clues for these things can be seen in the first year of life, since that's when they most commonly manifest. So some of the clues, first of all, if there's an imbalance in the brain, it creates an imbalance in muscle tone. And this imbalance in muscle tone manifests with altering motor milestones and tone. So one of the first things is, like, when I'm speaking to parents around the world who have kids, let's say, with autism, almost universally, these kids often have problems with even just sucking and latching on to breastfeed right off the bat. Right off the bat, they know that there's a problem because for some reason they can't latch on. They understand that it has to do with low muscle tone around their mouth, or the fact that they haven't developed what's called a rooting and sucking reflex, which is one of the primitive reflexes that we're born with. And so right off the bat, that shows that there's already imbalance that started in the brain. Mm-hmm. The right brain and the left brain develop in series, not in parallel. So the right brain develops predominantly in the womb. And for the first 2 to 3 years of life, it is more active, just about 30% more electrically active. Both sides are growing. And then after the 3 years, the left brain kicks in. And then the left brain predominantly develops. And so in the beginning of the first 6 years, the foundations and the differences of what will become the right brain and the left brain are really formed. And anything that alters that development or interferes with it, if it's an injury, if it is an infection, if there's something that alters the developmental stages, and these developmental, parents, I listen to them all the time. They're frustrated. They'll say, why does my pediatrician give me this list of milestones for my child? And then when they don't meet them and I go back to them and I say, they missed it, they say, well, don't worry about it. Well, if I'm not supposed to worry about it, why did you give me it to begin with? Mm-hmm. Right? It's just that they don't know what to do about it.
Right.
So, what we do know is that they are very important. A child has to crawl, and they have to crawl for a right time. They need to roll over at the right time. They need to crawl in the proper way. If they scoot on their butt or roll or drag a leg, it's a problem. It signifies that there's already a developmental imbalance that is altering the tone of the body. And this is a reflection of what's happening in the brain. And usually what we also see is there's this persistent of these primitive reflexes. When a child is born, they need to move and engage their environment to build the brain. They only have 25% of their brain there when they're born. By age 3, it should be 90% of the adult size. So the way it grows is by stimulating it. And the way we stimulate it is by moving and interacting with the world around us. And that turns on genes that build the networks and the connections in our brain. If we're not moving, then we're not building that. If we're moving in an imbalanced way, like we move more on one side than the other, then we're creating feedback in an imbalanced way. And this leads to an imbalance in the brain development. And so what we see is that the persistent of these primitive reflexes, they're there because the child doesn't have a brain yet, really, when they're born. So they need to move, but how do they move if they don't have a brain? So in the brainstem are these reflexes that allow them to do fairly complex movements, like roll over and move, and they have what we call tonic neck reflexes and rooting and sucking and grasping reflexes and orienting reflexes and startle responses. And these are things that allow them to move and engage and feed themselves. And then the brain builds in layers from the bottom up, and it helps. And as we get feedback, it builds up, and then it comes down and inhibits everything. But if the brain doesn't get to that next stage, because we have to get rid of those reflexes to then get more complex movement and more complex engagement. And what we see is that in almost all the kids that we see and adults that have persistent problems throughout their life, they still have many of these primitive reflexes there. And so what we see is that looking at those developmental milestones, And because the brain regulates everything, also looking at things like the immune system. Many of these kids have immune dysregulation, eczema, or chronic ear infections very early on. And that's another sign that there's a neurological imbalance.
You know, some of the things you said in there were really profound, because for moms and dads who really, I hear these things all the time, right? Where they notice that there's things that just don't seem right, where their kids don't seem balanced, or, you know, oftentimes they're told, well, you know, the child's scooted instead of crawling, and they're told that it's no big deal. But those things are huge deals.
Huge
because
deal.
when you talk about the need for symmetrical information to come into the brain, right? The brain, as you mentioned, requires that constant feedback. And a lot of people don't really realize how important the proprioceptive sense is to helping the brain to develop maximally.
It's the most important. Motor feedback, muscle feedback, and then the sensory senses that are driven by motor feedback is really what builds the brain.
Yeah.
You know, as like you said before, we tend to think of adults, we think like they're children of little adult brains. They're not. So, you know, what may stimulate our brain as adults doesn't work for kids. So the idea of doing things like flashcards, or trying to expose kids to things like computers or video games, or, you know, computer programs to make them smarter, is actually the worst thing you can do. It actually makes them dumber in the long run. We know that baby Einstein, that kids that watch those videos are actually worse off. Movement is what drives the brain. And the reason why we see an epidemic rise of these issues is because of the development primarily of computers and video games, and the fact that we've all become incredibly sedentary, and children are not outside running around in the grass and the trees and going and, you know, milking cows and doing things like they used to do. They don't move anymore. And, you know, from the very beginning, when I wrote my first textbook, I talked about that movement was the key to building the brain. I mean, when you look at the prefrontal cortex, which is literally where all of our cognitive abilities, our memory, our language, everything comes from. It grows out of the motor cortex. I mean, literally grows out of it. So if we don't develop the motor cortex first, then we won't develop cognitive abilities. And, you know, now there's a movement in research recognizing this. So 2 years ago, there was a conference with some of the best researchers in the world called Movement and Cognition. It was at Oxford University. I was one of the speakers. It was again at Harvard Medical School this summer, and I was the keynote speaker. And we had 400 papers presented from around the world. And this year, I'm the keynote speaker again, and it's going to be in Tel Aviv in Israel. So at the highest level of research now, we realize that movement is the driving force, especially in a child's brain. And if there is an imbalance of muscle tone or anything that alters or affects that, if we have persistent reflexes which alter movement patterns, then this has the most effect on creating an imbalance in the brain. And even in adults, movement, motor activity, physical exercise is what maintains our brain and maintains balance in our brain. So everybody knows, you know, like when we don't move and when we're lazy, we put on weight, we gain weight, we feel depressed, we feel anxious, we don't remember things anymore, we can't concentrate, we get angry all the time, you know, and these are all, the main effect is on the brain. And then the brain controls everything. So when the brain is out of balance, every system in the body has the potential of getting out of balance. It can cause, you know, digestive problems, immune problems, food sensitivities, autoimmunity. I believe in most cases, it almost always starts in the brain.
Yep. You know, one of the concepts that we talk about with a lot of our patients is the concept of plasticity. There's the wire together, fire together. And, you know, when a lot of the moms, dads are coming in, they're told that their kids will grow out of neurodevelopmental disorders. And what we oftentimes will teach them is that they don't grow out of, they grow into new and different things that are evolutions. And so for moms and dads who aren't familiar with that concept, can you talk to them about the importance of neuroplasticity, both in brain development when it goes off the rails and how to heal the brain?
Sure. You know, and as you said, people are given an often very confusing message because they're told many times when they get a label that these are lifelong conditions that will never go away. And then other times they'll say, well, they'll grow out of it. They never grow out of it, and it will last for them for a lifetime, but it doesn't have to. It can be corrected in almost every case. Even I work now almost, exclusively in my practice and around the world with severe nonverbal autistic kids. And there are kids that in autism, there's two subsets. It's what's called syndromic and non-syndromic. Syndromic are kids that have autism. It's about 10% and truly have a genetic mutation. Things like Fragile X, Down syndrome, tuberous sclerosis, but those are relatively rare. But the majority, 85, 90% of kids with autism don't have any genetic mutation. They have this severe developmental imbalance, and it has the possibility of being completely corrected. There's a lot of research showing that in many cases, even kids with severe nonverbal autism can be completely normalized. We've seen that many, many, many times in our center. I've seen it in my practice. And that's the most extreme version of the case. Because there is no genetic mutation, because there is no damage in the brain, and because there is this functional developmental imbalance, why can't someone get better? So the idea that people are told that your child will never get better, this is a lifelong sentence, drives me crazy because there's no evidence other than, the fact that people don't know what to do about it. Again, we have and I'm talking a large sample set, Scott. Like I said, we work with 40,000 kids in brain balance, hundreds of thousands of kids that have, with my books, I've trained over 10,000 professionals that themselves have worked with tens of thousands of patients. So, the fact is that the brain and the genes, if they're not damaged, they can be turned back on. And that is really the basis of neuroplasticity, is that turning genes on and building the brain and building connection. We never lose that ability. The idea years ago also that if you don't intervene in the first 3 years, there's nothing you can do has also been proven to be completely wrong. That you can change the brain throughout our entire life. It's easiest when they're young, but if the brain is healthy, you can do it at any point in time in their life. So, for parents who are often, their hope is taken away from them early on, it drives me crazy because, most of the people that are saying that really don't know what they're talking about. They really don't know what the actual problem is, but yet they're very convinced that you can't do anything about it.
It's so true. And I hear that exact same thing all the time. And so I'm really glad that you said that, because I think it's really important for moms and dads to realize that there is so much more that the brain is capable of doing that oftentimes they're told. So for moms and dads who aren't familiar with what could be done, so your approach is extremely comprehensive. So would you be able to describe what types of things would be done to try and help? Let's say, for example, let's take a child with autism. You obviously go through an extremely complex and comprehensive assessment, and then you develop a care plan based upon your assessment. Could you give some examples of number one, what the assessments would look like, and then two, what a care plan would look like so that they would have a better understanding?
Sure. So everything I do is based on what I call a brain developmental blueprint. It's basically the way the brain is designed to develop. And these are all the things we're talking about, like going through motor milestones and then speech and then cognitive language and how our digestive system develops, how our immune system develops, how our hormone system. So it's all based on that. That's what I teach doctors out there. That's how I run my own practice. And so the idea is we're looking at these different things and depending on, let's say, a child with autism, again, there are different levels of autism, of course. There are some kids that are completely nonverbal and, young and really can't do anything on their own. So the care plan for them looks very different than a kid, let's say, with high functioning Asperger's that can really do a lot of things independently. And we can get them to do more complex stuff. But the bottom line is it takes them through the stages. So what we're looking for first and foremost is, is there a presence of primitive reflexes? Do they have normal core stability and muscle tone? So is there an asymmetry of muscle tone? And then we're looking at, do they have an imbalance in their brain where one side of their brain is more active than the other, and which side of the brain is underactive and underdeveloped? And then we may do a whole battery of tests to really identify more. Is there more of a visual problem processing, auditory processing? What type? Both sides of the brain process sound and light and tactile and smells and movement and proprioceptive input and vestibular input differently, as well as there's different cognitive skills that the right brain and left brain do. The left brain is verbal. The right brain is nonverbal. The left brain does basic math operations. The right brain does math reasoning and geometry. The left brain likes algebra. The right brain likes spatial math. The left brain does spelling. The right brain builds attachments and relationships. The right brain controls the big muscles. The left brain controls the small muscles. So all of these things are different. And even all the academic subjects and all of the different cognitive skills, the right brain, left brain both do everything, but the left brain has an advantage for certain things versus the right brain. So we assess all of these things. I've developed certain tools that can be used. We have what's called a master hemispheric checklist. You can see it in my book, Disconnected Kids. It covers everything because, again, the brain controls everything. So it can affect everything. And we need to then take everything into consideration when we're looking to change the brain. That's part of the problem why a lot of other programs don't work, is they usually look at one piece of the puzzle. They look just at motor activity or physical activity or just sensory stimulation or just sound or just eye movements, or they look at just trying to do things cognitively, or they look at just trying to do things through diet and nutrition. You have to look at all of those things, and it's different. The combination of all those things is unique to each child, but all of them need to be considered. So we look at all functional measurements for all of them, and then based on those functional measurements and what side of the brain and what reflexes are still there, we put together a program. If it's a nonverbal autistic child, what I do is I train the parents on how to do these stimulations on their own child. And the first thing we need to do is get rid of these primitive reflexes. We need to start building some balance in their muscle tone. And then we need to stimulate and use sensory stimulation to stimulate one side of the brain more than the other. And that is the basis of everything. We also need to look at diet and nutrition and maybe eliminate certain foods that might temporarily be causing inflammation. Give them vitamins and minerals. But again, a lot of the times, if there's an imbalance in the brain, they have malabsorption. So they're not absorbing a lot of those vitamins and minerals. We may have to, do different types of sensory stimulation. But in young kids, doing things cognitively is not the first step, which is what every other program primarily does. The brain grows from the bottom up, and then it comes from the top down. And most of the other approaches start with the top down. So things like behavioral interventions, neurofeedback, academic training, trying to get a kid who can't read to read. Those are top-down approaches that don't make sense unless you first build the bottom up. So we will do cognitive activities later on, but the first thing we need to do is get rid of those reflexes. Now, if the child can do things on their own, we have exercises that that the child is prescribed to do at home on a regular basis. If they're going to see a doctor that I've trained, the doctor may do things like adjustments, or they may do the exercises in their office. They may use other types of stimulation. We use things like TENS stimulation. We use smell, light. We use music. We use sound. We use vestibular stimulation. Some people will do that in their office and then supplement it with home. Some people, it will just be a home program. In our centers, again, it's brain balance centers. It's a different model because it's more, it's very comprehensive. but it's a little bit more. We do things as a group. We do it almost. It's an academic type of setting. It's more educational. So there's different models that are out there. But in my practice, if I'm working with a lot of people around the world, or they'll come to New York and I do the assessment and then they go home. And that's important because to really change the brain, the idea of neuroplasticity, the most important thing is frequency, meaning doing things a lot. So we have parents doing things, simple, easy things like stroking the cheek, 10 times, shining light in the eye, or, doing simple things that take a few seconds or a minute. But we have them doing maybe, 10, 15, 20 of those things a day, but we have them doing it 2 to 3 times a day, 6, 7 days a week. This is how we get dramatic changes. And you can't do that in a center. And that, it's kind of cost prohibitive if you were to try, but it doesn't make sense. So that's why a home program is really a very important part of whatever you're going to do. And along with that is compliance. So what I found is that I put together recently, I just did a webinar the other day. We'll be doing it again soon on a parent group therapy coaching type of platform. So I found that since I have people around the world, I do the assessment and they're on their own. How do I keep them consistent? How do they keep them compliant? How do I still answer their questions when it comes out? And so we do a group call with parents from around the world, sometimes once a week or once a month. And I educate them because the more educated they are, the more likely they are to really understand what they're doing and to be consistent and compliant. It also gives a support group so people don't feel like they're isolated or alone, which most people do feel, which really affects their motivation. And also they have an accountability. Somebody's actually saying, hey, did you do the exercises this week? And they have the group accountability, which is what we see with group therapy. That's why it works. And AA, that's why it works, right? And so people are supported. But then I also individually answer everybody's questions and address each child. So they get individual, but they also get to learn from the collective, and they're part of a community and a group. And this is really something I've added over the past year or two, and it's made a huge difference, especially when I'm working with people. I mean, I've talked to 2 families today already from Bulgaria. No, one from Bulgaria, one from the UK. And so, they need support. They need to be able to feel like they're supported. So, the care program is really depending on the level of the child. It's individualized, but there's an idea to it. We take them through these things. It's comprehensive, that every child's going to have some diet and nutrition, vitamins we're going to recommend. Their foods they're going to eliminate is individual to the child. We're going to do exercises, primitive reflexes, core stability. We're going to do sensory stimulation, and we're going to direct it towards one hemisphere more than the other. That's the foundation of everything we do. And then later on, we'll also add cognitive skills that are specific to one hemisphere or the other. We're always going towards the weak side, and we're always building up the weak side to create this balance.
I love so much of what you said in terms of the comprehensiveness of the program, how it's individualized. One of the things that you said that I really took from this, and I want moms and dads to hear this, is that for those of you who feel like you're isolated and on a bubble, because I hear that every day from many moms and dads who are coming in, is they feel very alone. And they feel like they're going through this struggle without support. The community aspect of what you're building, I commend you for doing that, because it's something that's really needed. We do the same thing here in the practice. We try to make a lot of connection, but being able to get people together so that you can crowdsource and hear the information, support each other is huge, because the struggles a child goes through so dramatically impacts the quality of life of not just the child, but of the entire family. And so the healing process is a familial healing process, not just the individual. And so that it's a great thing to hear that kind of support. Now, one of the things I think is tremendous, and I find that a lot of people don't do this, is you give a lot of really of the information that you use, you give it away.
Yes.
I've read your books, I've read all your books, and one of the things I think is great for you moms and dads is that he doesn't hold anything back in the books. He's literally, all of the secrets to the sauce are in the books, Disconnected Kids, Reconnected Kids, the nutrition plan, Autism. because what he's talking about is that all of the things he referenced, the master hemispheric checklist, the sensory integration techniques, they're all there. Because the goal is to try and give you the tools and resources that you need so that you can have the greatest access to information to help your child. So that's something, if you haven't read his books, I strongly encourage you to go and get the books. I will have the links on the show notes page to all of the books, so you can go ahead and get those, along with links back to your website, because your website is just also tremendously loaded with resources for children and for adults. And I'd love if you could spend some time talking about the resources that you have available and services that you provide through your website and in your private practice.
Yeah, well, what you said is very true. From the very beginning, I looked at this, my outcome from the very beginning 20 years ago was, how do I help this epidemic? How do I try to stop or delay it? And that was my goal. And so I created a program that, I believe, and I know really based on research, it is nothing like it out there. And it is the most effective tool. Anybody can do it and use it. And so I believe, you have to give it out as much. I've spent, 20 years training doctors all over the world and therapists and training parents and giving it to them and creating even new resources. Like I said, parents that feel like they're isolated and alone, always looking at how do I make it better? How do I get better responses? How do I make it cheaper? How do I make it more, so doing something at home for your own child is the cheapest and most effective thing you can do if you do it. Mm-hmm. But if you don't do it, then it's a waste then it's not going to do anything. So mm-hmm. How do we get people to do it? So that's where people go to my website, drrobertmelillo.com, and there is a one there. You can click on it about a parent group therapy type of program where people could use my book, but then they could also get on a phone with other parents and with me and ask questions, and we could lead them through a home program. I do that also with doctors and clinicians. I coach them as well on how to be able to develop these types of programs in their practice and in their office. And I have people that I'm trying to get the word out so that, we have parents that have gone through our program or have been my patients, and they've learned so much by reading my books and using this on their own child that they've said, I felt like I got a degree. And how do I use it now? I want to go out there and spread the word with you. So now I've developed what's called a brain integration coaching program where I train people with basic knowledge of my work, but how to be able to go and bring this into every walk of life. I mean, we have people bringing it into addiction centers and into corporations and into personal development. I think this is one of the most important discoveries in science ever. And, to prove that, really, there's been a study going on at Harvard Medical School and at McLean Hospital. McLean Hospital is the #1 mental institution in the world. It's been going on for a couple of years now, looking at my work like, the home program that I put together in Disconnected Kids, just the sensory and motor exercise and primitive reflex exercises, not even looking at the diet and nutrition and cognitive. And so it's a 15-week study where kids have ADHD. They are doing these exercises at home once or twice a day for 10 or 15 minutes. They do interactive metronome on alternating days. So 3 days a week, they do my exercises. And then they did a battery of psychological and academic tests before and after, and the most cutting edge brain imaging on the planet. This is, again, Harvard Medical School, and they are part of what's called the Human Connectome Project, if you've heard about it. But anyway, they have a machine there's only like 6 of them in the world. And so what they found in preliminary data was not only were the changes on the psychological and academic tests like nothing they've really seen before, but when they got the follow-up brain imaging and looked at the actual changes in connectivity and structural changes in the brain, especially to the right side of the brain exclusively, and then dampening the overactivity on the left side of the brain, nothing like that has ever been documented before anywhere. So this may be one of the most significant studies that has ever come out in the field of neuroscience and looking at brain plasticity. And the whole difference was doing the exercises in a unilateral way. It made all the difference. So that study is actually probably going to be coming out in about 2 or 3 months. And I think you're probably going to see it all over the news. But, because it's so important, I want to get this out there in every way. So if people go to my website, obviously I have my books they can get anywhere through Amazon or through my website. They have the parent coaching programs they can be a part of. At this point, the highest level thing they can get is either to go to a brain balance center, or if they can't get to one, then to come see me. I have my practice in New York City. I'm always seeing people from all over. I travel over the world and see patients when I travel as well. We're developing a network also of the people that I've trained that we can refer people to. And then if people want to really learn more and actually even create a business out of this science, coaching other people on it in different fields, that's something that I do as well. And that's called the Brain Integration Coaching Program. And now, the number one question I get when I go out and lecture is when I come off stage, I'm talking about kids, and the first question I get is, what about adults? And the fact is, this problem has been going on for at least 30 years. So now the kids that started this wave are now adults. And so what we see is that ADHD is the number one mental disorder amongst the youth. It now is becoming the number one mental disorder amongst the adults. 1 in 5 kids in the United States have some sort of severe mental diagnosis. 1 in 5 adults have some sort of severe mental diagnosis. It's not a coincidence. So I'm coming out in the next couple of weeks with an adult ADHD program that will be done online. So people can access the whole program to help correct their ADHD or some other type of similar related problem, where I educate them like a course, but then I give them specific exercises. It's like an exercise video that they can follow, that also gives them advice about diet and nutrition and how to stimulate their brain with senses and look at their own primitive reflexes. And so that adult ADHD program will be coming out in the next week or two.
That's
and they can get that all through my website.
That's tremendous. We'll make sure that we have all of those links in the show notes so that for the moms and dads that are watching this, everyone can go through, find the resources, and get the help they need, so that regardless of whatever the struggle is, whether it's their struggle, their child's struggle, that they can help to go and get their child's brain or their brain back to maximum function and restoring that quality of life that we all deserve. So Dr. Melillo, I thank you so much for your time. Moms and dads, make sure that you go and visit Dr. Melillo's website. Follow him on social media, because, boy, you're everywhere. Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, YouTube. You've got your Dr. Rob show and tons of great resources and information available. So Dr. Rob, I thank you so much for taking the time and spending this great hour with us to really help the moms and dads in the community.
Well, thank God for what you're doing and spreading the word out there. This is such a huge problem. Parents are struggling. So whatever we all can do to help. And I appreciate, you having me on, and anybody that's listening, I appreciate your time. And, I'm glad people like you are around. So thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rob. And moms and dads, make sure that you go and visit his website, buy his books, and contact Dr. Melillo if you want to go and get his services directly. And I will tell you, moms and dads, I've been a personal witness to the success that this program can have in adults and children's lives. So make sure that you get in contact with Dr. Melillo, and go and visit him at drrobertmelillo.com. This is Dr. Scott. God bless you all. Be elite. Thank you for listening to the Growing Healthy Families podcast, the world's #1 source for health education. Make sure to go to iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a review. Make sure to follow us on social media at the links listed in the show notes, and let us know what area of health you are struggling with, so we can get you and your family on the road to epic health.